now we are joined by one of my favorite people, Anna Kasparian, who is a host and producer for the Young Turks, is the co-host with Nanda Vila of the Weekends show on Jacobin, which airs a little bit before this records, which is on purpose because I didn't want to have to stop watching that to record this. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Ben. I'm really happy to be here.
So, yeah, one thing that you've talked about recently on Weekends, not this week but last week, is about what we were just talking about, basically, essentially with the last two guests, right? You know, which was about capitalism and how we could maybe try to, to get beyond it. And one thing that we're often told on that subject is that basically, like, the state equals unfreedom, capitalism equals freedom, that if you want to be able to live your life the way that you want to, you want to, for example, have privacy in your information, then capitalism, the sort of current economic system that we have is going to be your friend. And I know that's not your recent experience, and this is something that you've talked about recently on the show, why you think it's like a serious mistake to think that things are going to shake out that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because basically what happened with that segment, and that commentary was I was targeted by a hacker, and he was pretty relentless, made my life miserable for over a week. And I started really wanting to understand how it is that hackers can do anything they want. Like, they can find any information on you. It made me curious about the various ways we're being surveilled, the various ways data is being collected on us, and how really data has been commodified, right? And so I decided to take like my frustration and anger out on that segment and learn more, just kind of educate myself more about data capitalism. And so I came across a lot of really great essays on this, and it became abundantly clear to me that since our data has been commodified, and since we're essentially unpaid workers in willy-nilly handing over all this private data to various corporations, be it Google or Facebook, we literally cannot have privacy. We just can't, because there is a very significant vested interest in collecting that data, meaning surveilling us, and then selling that data to third parties. And that's really Facebook's bread and butter. That's Google's bread and butter. I mean, they are not what they appear to be. Like, on the surface, Facebook is, social networking site. But in reality, they're data brokers. And they're advertisers.
That's the business model, because if they're not finding some way to either directly sell your data, right, or to use it to get your eyeballs on advertisement, then Facebook and the rest would be charities, right? There'd be no way for them to make money. Newsflash, right? Mark Zuckerberg is not in this for humanitarian reasons. That these guys are business owners, and they are trying to make money, and so of course we want to be able to connect to each other these ways, right? Like everybody, God knows, especially now that that just leaving the house, right, is so is so much more fraught, than it used to be, right? We all need ways to communicate with the people that we care about, to stay in touch with people we might not otherwise stay in touch with, right? So social media definitely serves that, but having it be in the hands of these private corporations means that you're a lot more likely. Yes, somebody asked, that is my cat Shabazz. The door is open, but he's still being a cat and wandering around and meowing. But because these are in the hands of private corporations, this isn't just a matter of saying, okay, all complex ecosystems have parasites. You're going to get you're going to get hackers and stalkers and, all kinds of terrible people sort of nibbling around the edges, of any setup where they think they have an opening. But this is also due to the data practices of these corporations. Like, they're not just innocent bystanders in this.
Absolutely. Exactly. And, what was really fascinating to me in like researching this particular segment was coming across various CEOs in Silicon Valley who were not only transparent about the surveillance and collection of our data, but unapologetic about it, just kind of saying boldly, if you haven't done anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. But in reality,
which sounds like exactly like John Ashcroft talking about the Patriot Act,
Yes,
like this is exactly what like government representatives justifying government surveillance would say. Oh, if you haven't done anything wrong, then what are you complaining about? Even though, of course, like, people tell things to Google, essentially. Like, if you think about everything you've ever searched for on Google, people tell things to this company that they wouldn't tell to their best friend or their priest.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But even if somehow you're like this, I guess, miracle person who's never done anything embarrassing, who's never searched for anything embarrassing, it doesn't matter, because in one way or the other, this type of collection of your personal data makes you vulnerable to bad actors. So that's honestly what I was dealing with, right? Because what was going through my mind was, how is it that my address, like this person has my address? And just to give you guys some context, I have gone through numerous headaches to basically conceal my address. I started a shell corporation in order to put the address, to put my property, my little condo, under that shell corporation. So when someone searches for me in public records, they're not able to find my address. So then I realized, I made the mistake by ordering something online and having it delivered to me directly. And that's it. You only need to do it once. And that information is connected to your name. And all you need is that website, that company to get hacked. All of that information gets sold on the dark web. And, if you're a public figure, you go through absolute hell in dealing with someone who's targeting you. So that's like, I guess, more of an extreme example. But I think what we're also noticing is that our data is being used to create the algorithms that keep us in these like data bubbles, right? And these, I guess, ideological bubbles. And so Facebook loves that. That's also part of their business model, because it triggers, your brain. Like, it's like cocaine. You come across content that's more and more extreme, or you come across content that reinforces your preconceived notions, and it becomes addictive, right? And you stay engaged in that social media platform, and that's what they want to sell to advertisers as well. So there's a lot of really great, scholarly work on this stuff. But the one thing I wanted to like really elaborate on, I didn't think I did a good enough job in my segment, so I'll do it here. Data capitalism really focuses on the imbalance of power, right? So really, the people who have the capability of processing the data and making sense of it are the ones who are, experiencing a great deal of power. And that power imbalance negatively impacts the vast majority of people. So, I think anytime you talk about how capitalism impacts certain parts of our lives, certain freedoms, it is important to think about power dynamics and how they play a role.
Yeah, and what you're talking about the ideological bubbles, the algorithms, that social media use to kind of keep us in those. That also relates to something that I've seen you talk a lot about lately, which is, because these are commodities, right? Like your use of social media is a product, right? Ultimately designed to be sold to, advertisers, then to sell other stuff to you. They, like any profit-making corporation, right? They want to make it as addictive as at all possible, right? If you can find a way to get people to use your thing more, right? Then you're going to do that. And this feeds into outrage culture in a really bad way because they have all these mechanisms, these like feedback loops,
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that every single social media platform includes some version of like likes and retweets that are designed to give you that like little dopamine hit, that like that, oh, I'm getting like lots of people seeing this and giving me some sort of approval, and oftentimes the things that solicit that, right, are anytime you can be like performatively outraged at someone who has, because most of us are not those miracle people, that you just referred to, who've never done anything bad or anything even that could be presented in a way that looks bad, right? Which is
Right.
often enough, right? Like this case that I saw you talking about today of this progressive Democratic primary candidate Alex Morse, who was vilified. Lots of people who shall remain nameless for this segment, who should know better, went along
Mm-hmm.
with this, for essentially the sin of allegedly matching and hooking up with people who were 4 years younger than him, maybe, if that.
Right. Yeah,
Who,
it was just nonsense, like absolute nonsense. I mean, Alex Morse, he's 31 right now, and he became the mayor of Holyoke when he was 22, I believe. And so when he was on both Tinder and Grindr, he was between the ages of 25 and 30. And so he would just match with people on these dating sites or dating apps who happened to be college students because he was so young himself. So of course, it's like similar age. It's the same age group,
yeah, not
and
his
so
students, but students.
not his students exactly. And so, you hear these arguments about how, well, even if they're not his students, there's a power imbalance there because he was an adjunct professor, and it's like, do you guys understand how little power, like part-time, like lectures, like it's just like they act as if it's like, oh my God, this is like some authoritarian dictator
Yeah,
has all this power over these.
yeah,
It's like, relax.
yeah. I
And
was a I was an adjunct professor for years at Rutgers in New Jersey, and I mean, I of course had zero job security, or a little bit,
mhm,
because adjuncts were unionized there, but very close to zero job security. Um, Certainly no employer health insurance. Like as an adjunct, often you're getting like the crappiest like version of like what's available on the Obamacare exchanges. There are
yeah,
like literally, certainly at that university, right? There are like literally graduate students who are getting paid more a year than adjuncts were. So the fact that somebody, like, it is to what's in your head when you hear the word professor, being an adjunct is to that what being an Uber driver is to being a taxi driver who might at least, be a member of the Teamsters and all that stuff, right? So it's I mean, like, that's just one more layer of this, right? That like this neoliberal hellscape we're in, where like most people who have some kind of teaching job are either adjuncts, or maybe they have like full-time renewable contracts, but basically no security. And so the idea that he had like tons of power, not
I
only
know.
over his own students, which was like, even that's like really not that much, right? But that he had tons of power over any random person who happened to be a college student is a little
Yeah.
bizarre. Liza Featherstone, who was on the show last week, who's a columnist for Jacobin, has a really good article there. It's called something like "The Left Needs to Stop Falling for Absurd Sex Panics," where she points out that if you're going to really run with this reasoning that anything that could possibly be described as a power differential makes consent impossible, oh, well, one of the standout lines from the piece is, "I have bad news for these kids about heterosexuality." Or, in general, right? Like, there's so many things you could say are power differentials in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of, lots of things where there are actually more plausible stories that you could tell about power differentials than you could tell between an adjunct professor and a student who wasn't even his student, who was about the same age as him. So this is like an especially absurd example, But I think the larger problem, the one that relates to what you're talking about with surveillance capitalism, is this kind of general culture of mutual surveillance, that like
Mm-hmm.
um, your co-host Nando had a really good line today about how, like if you think about, especially in the context of left political organizing, that we want to change all kinds of really basic things about the society we live in. The only way you can possibly do that is if you convince a majority of the public to agree with you. And I think,
Yeah.
okay, who do you want to hang out with, right? The person who says, here's a great party, come hang out with, you'll have fun. Or the person who says, all right, come over to this place this time, everybody bring a camera so you can monitor each other and then like report each other if anybody does anything bad.
It's just, I mean, yeah. And look, I think I'm particularly like critical of when the left does it, because I want us to win, right?
Right,
Like I
exactly.
want us to understand power and find strategic ways to actually get things done, as opposed to spending the vast majority of our time on Twitter fighting one another. And to be clear, there are incredible leftists who aren't even really on Twitter. They're out there doing the
Mm.
organizing. They're doing what they can to think
Probably,
strategically.
probably
Mhm.
both much happier and much more politically effective than those of us who,
Yes,
have to be on there. So yeah, no question about that, right?
100%.
Like if you can get off, you should. But for everybody who does feel either just to connect with people, or because, for example, they're journalists, you kind of have to be, on Twitter. Uh, like there's a third dimension of all of this, which is that because these are private corporations, that means that essentially it's the equivalent of if we lived in what, well, you know, uh, my my friend Dave Smith, with whom I disagree, might think would be okay. I would have a big problem with, which would be like some sort of libertarian utopia where everything was privatized. If like if the roads were private, right, that would
Mhm.
mean that you couldn't have a protest where you marched down the street unless whichever rich person who owned the road was okay with it and agree with your cause. Uh, and the way that maybe it's pretty easy to see why that's a problem, it's also a problem when you have these giant profit-seeking corporations. So essentially you have this very small number of rich people who are in charge of deciding what you can say digitally,
Mhm.
right? On Facebook, on Twitter, on all of these, that there are, community guidelines, but those are incredibly vague and subjective. There
Yeah,
are,
it is interesting because people try to make the argument that it's okay if your freedoms are being violated as long as they're being violated by private companies as opposed to the government. So, when I was, thinking about how to frame my argument against data capitalism or surveillance capitalism, I thought about the fact that there really is a marriage between the private and public sector when it comes to surveilling you, really. I mean, when
absolutely.
you think about what uh, various whistleblowers told us about government spying, we learned about how easily telecommunications companies worked with the federal government and handed over all sorts of data and metadata about us that we were completely unaware of. They did it indiscriminately. It didn't matter if you were a good person or a bad person. It didn't matter if there was any evidence or probable cause, right? It was just everyone's being surveilled indiscriminately. And what that does is, whether it's a corporation or the government, it
Mm,
could lead to forms of intimidation, right?
right.
Because everything about you, all of this information about you, every thought that you Google search is in the hands of people who can misuse it and abuse it. And that's something that we need to be incredibly careful about.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like this combination, like it's this perfect storm of the fact that uh, the companies do all this stuff to try to make the product more addictive, which in turn like feeds into all of the worst like pathologies of like online political discussion, which oftentimes people dismiss, oh, that's just online, whatever, don't worry about it, right? But of course, in practice, that's where a lot of people get news and information and talk about politics and even organizing, politically now that it's so much dicier, right, to do that in person, because of the coronavirus, and that this is all happening in a situation where there's really no guaranteed privacy at all, right? Because the companies will gleefully, harvest your information for, to sell advertising. They're also, as you said, they're in a they're thoroughly in bed with government surveillance, right? That there's a long history of this, but basically, anytime the national security state says, "Hey, we'd like to look at something," you're almost never going to get Facebook, Twitter, Google, fighting them on that, right? Like they
Right.
generally just say, why would they do that, right? Like, what's in it for them? It's not their information, and they benefit, from having that cozy relationship, right? So they hand it right over, and because it's a private corporation, they're like those road owners, right? There aren't any laws particularly regulated who gets to drive on the road or who gets to hold a protest march down the road. It's just up to them, right? And then also, because it's where so much left political discussion happens, which again, I'm on the same page as you there, that it's like, I think a lot of these things are much more general problems. It's certainly not limited to the left. If you read, for example, John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, one of his main examples in there is about somebody named Lindsay Stone, who was just like a random private citizen, and like she and her friend would go around to different sites and they'd take jokey photographs. And one of them was at Arlington National Cemetery, and there's a sign that says silence and respect. And of course, she wasn't actually saying anything, but the gag for the photo was that she had her mouth open, like, right? And and then, she thought that like 10 of her friends maybe would like see it on Facebook, because like most people, she didn't pay very much attention to the photo settings. And she was just like mercilessly dragged about this for like a long time. And in that case, it was mostly by like conservative, patriotic military veterans, but like really like to the point where like every time she had a job interview, she'd be like, okay, if they Googled me, they saw this, she like didn't want to go out on dates because she thought the other person would like Google her and see this. It just like completely destroyed this person's life for a long time. So it's certainly not limited to the left, but it's especially concerning on the left because we want the left to win. And this kind of thing makes most people just want nothing to do with us.
And not only that, I mean, it's antithetical to what the left is supposed to represent. And what I specifically mean by that, I mean, what is the left fighting for, right?
Right.
We want to make sure that humans live a life of dignity, that they are fed, clothed, that, healthcare is a human right. I mean, we want to make sure that we protect the livelihoods of people, right? I assume like that's what the whole core of socialism really is. And so why are we joining online groups of people who are calling for individuals to be fired, to lose their livelihoods? Like, how is that okay?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like, either, and again, it goes right back to what we were talking about the social media platforms, because there's the version of it where in both cases, there's this like weird impulse to tattle to authority figures that we don't even necessarily think should exist. So whether it's like ratting people out to, to Twitter to try to get them, banned, or it's ratting people out to their employers, that they've tweeted something problematic. And, again, sometimes the things that count as bad here, I mean, all I think is, oh my God, if anybody had like, all the time, I was living in Miami in my 20s, like when I'd like go out to, this like bar in South Miami with my friends and like, just like joke around like human beings do, if somebody had like a running transcript of that, right, there's like, I'm sure I've said like 1,000 things that are worse than like anything that I've seen people often like get slammed for. and get these like severe like social ostracism for online.
Yeah, I mean, look, I had a raver phase. Like I loved going to raves and I could never, I mean, I'm a little older now, so I probably wouldn't even want to go to a rave. But I just think about like, hey, these nights when, I mean, not during the pandemic, but before, when I wanted to just go out and dance,
Yeah,
and maybe have a drink or two and literally like just let loose and not worry about a
yeah,
thing. All that goes through my mind is everyone has a phone. Everyone is ready and willing to film me in like my worst moment, maybe even take me out of context, put it online, and then I'm done. And look, I'm really lucky that, TYT is where I've grown career wise. And Cenk Uygur, for whatever anyone might think about him, does not cave in to any type of cancel culture or any type of pressure to fire people because of mistakes they've made. And trust me, there have been, issues in the past. And he's just like, no, I know these people. I work with these people. I'm not turning my back on them. And I felt that same level of respect and I guess loyalty from
yeah,
Michael Brooks.
yeah,
And I
of
love
course.
that about him because that made me realize, like, you know what? It's okay to kind of critique what we're seeing right now online publicly, and he did it skillfully, strategically, and he's always incredibly nuanced. But I think that if we want to win, which is what he focused on a lot, we need to be appealing to a broader group of people, and we need to understand that we have differences, right? That's not to say that we accept disgusting, racist
Right,
rhetoric
of
or
course.
hateful language. But I do think that, digging through someone's Twitter feed to find, a nasty tweet from 2009, it says you have some problems. Like you should not be
Yeah,
wasting your time doing that. Just keeping it
yeah,
real.
yeah, no question. And it's particularly self-defeating. Like, well, like in Cenk's case, when he, when he was running for office, and uh, people brought back to life things that he had said literally more than a decade ago,
Hmm.
as a conservative,
Two
right?
decades ago. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, and so it's like particularly bad because like in that case, you know, even beyond any impact on him or his campaign or what that could have accomplished, that like the message you're sending to everybody else, right?
Yeah.
Is that, hey, all right, let's say that right now you have bad politics and you say dumb things. You don't have the option of seeing the error of your ways, right? Being convinced that we're right about politics, and then
Hmm.
like coming to have healthier attitudes about all these other things that like maybe you like said stupid or bigoted things about before, because we are going to literally continue to hold that against you forever. Like, why would you tell
Yeah.
people that if you actually wanted to win them over?
Then there's literally no incentive to evolve, to grow, to change. And if the first, few words you hear from someone are incredibly antagonistic, then, you're less willing to open yourself up to their perspective.
Yeah,
If someone approach it like that, I think it just makes a lot more sense to try to persuade people to open up a dialogue. And that's not easy to do. It's actually very difficult and uncomfortable at times to engage in some of these, these dialogues about controversial issues, especially about race. But you have to. That's how you win people over. You don't really do anything other than really help our enemies in
yeah,
creating these factions within the left. And that's really what I've been noticing. It's just this, you know, confusion about who our enemies really are.
yeah,
And really, I love that you use this phrase in your latest Jacobin piece, and Michael used it in his book, confused moralism, right? It's
yeah,
confused moralism. In reality, you're creating a situation where people are just fragmented and don't have any connection to one another. And if we keep perpetuating that, I mean, it's going to make accomplishing what we want to accomplish in this country, in this world, a lot more difficult than it needs to be.
yeah, no question. That, we need to be able to make some differentiations that, like, sure, there's no moral argument that you can give to Jeff Bezos that's just going to convince him to give away his, I guess now it's $1 trillion, and or turn Amazon into a worker co-op or any of these things, right? Like, that's not going to happen. You have to take it from him. But some random person who, like, you just happen to get into a political argument with, who doesn't have $1 trillion and all the incentives that come from that, is not going to be in that category. Or even somebody who's a media figure, like you need to be able to make some basic distinctions about, okay, who has some, like, deeply entrenched worldview that's their whole thing, and, like, short of a life-changing experience, they're not going to agree with you, versus who just disagrees, right? Like sometimes
Yeah.
people just disagree because, like, they've had different experiences, they've been exposed to different sources of information, they've heard different arguments, they might even actually start to agree with you if you just kind of, like, calmly explained your perspective and talk to them like they were a human being, and your opening move wasn't, oh my God, you're a scumbag because you don't have the right take on this yet. And one thing, you brought up our late friend and collaborator, Michael Brooks, and one thing that I really appreciated about him when he talked about this stuff, I think, is maybe because he had this other side, this kind of spiritual side, all of this, right? That, like, somebody like me, I'm very comfortable, like, making, like, a strategic argument that all these things are counterproductive, right? But, like, he was much more comfortable just, like, being an unapologetic hippie about it and just talking about, just compassion and how people can change and all this stuff that's really good and really true and really valuable, but, like, not everybody can maybe as equally access that kind of language, or think that way or talk that way.
Yeah.
And it's one of many, like, really valuable things that I think that he that he brought to what he did, that he brought to the critique that he certainly made on these issues, but also just in general, right? Because I think that that's another thing where most people aren't going to have the, necessarily the same hangups about that stuff that some of us are, that, like, I think most people can kind of see the power in just sort of saying, like, hey, don't be like this, right? Like that
Yeah.
this isn't how we want to be, right? And of course it also ties into the larger thing you're talking about, because this isn't what we're fighting for in the first place, right? That, like, we don't want to like, in a way, like, this whole thing where we should just constantly be surveilling each other to see if, like, anybody ever had a bad take or told a tasteless joke or anything like that. Like, in a way, like, this really gets into this way of thinking about what's wrong with society that's, like, would be a much more natural fit for, like, conservatives who think that, oh, if there's
Hmm.
crime and other social problems, it's because people have, like, bad characters. If our whole thing is that we want to, well, again, reach, go back to Michael, be ruthless with systems and kind to people, that we think that, no, it's not just because, like, some people are just randomly bad people or they have bad culture or anything like this, but that there are bad systems in place, that lead to outcomes that we don't like. And that what we
Yeah.
want is not to try to perfect individuals, right? To, like, reach in and, like, change the thoughts in your head so you're always thinking correct things and having the right attitude
Yeah.
towards everything. What we want is to create a society in which everybody can have their basic needs met, and people can have more control over their lives, both at work and everywhere else, and have, honestly, more privacy. So you can, because the more privacy that you have, the more of a sense of just a almost like a cultural safety net, that, like, that you understand that everybody's going to relate to you as a human being, and is not going to decide that whatever you were at your worst moment is what defines you forever, right? Like that's
Right.
part of what we want for everybody, which is why we're doing all of this in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really great way to put it. And also, I think a really great way to start thinking about this is, practice some skepticism when you come across the latest outrage on Twitter, right? And ask yourself, okay, could there potentially be some motivations behind publishing this like negative article on this person? Because I can tell you from personal experience, you brought up the blogs that Cenk wrote literally 20 to 25 years ago. And right before they were published and, the outrage began, this was about 2 years ago, I received an email from a reporter who wanted me to comment on the environment at TYT. And I think the wording was, have you had any experiences with Cenk Uygur fostering an environment of misogyny at TYT? So I actually responded back and I was like, well, to tell you the truth, I really feel that Cenk has empowered me to speak my mind. I have a very strong voice here. I never feel like I have to agree with him. I've disagreed with him many times with, no retaliation. Like it was just, and that's literally my experience. I mean, I started there doing marketing. I mean, I had no experience in marketing. I can't believe he hired me for that. But he saw I was a hard worker. And then all of a sudden I'm doing one segment a day and I'm doing like an hour on celebrity gossip. But Cenk was open-minded enough to have me constantly challenge him and give me the position that I felt I deserved. So now I've like taken over the main show and I'm like the lead host and all of that. And a misogynistic guy doesn't do that. I mean, we disagree and argue all, but anyway, the reason why I'm giving you all this background is because he never published my statement. That statement was never published because what he was doing was politically motivated. And it was just so frustrating to see that. And it was frustrating to see people turn their backs on Cenk so easily, just based on, again, blogs he had written 20 to 25 years ago. And we really need to practice a little bit of humility and think about us as college students, for instance, and, the dialogue we engaged in, the activities we participated in. I don't think that they're indicative of who we are as people. I think that people have the capacity to evolve and change and to better themselves. I mean, just in the last 3 years, I've changed considerably on a number of different issues, politically, even to some extent spiritually, although I still, identify as an atheist, but Michael's kind of opened me up to that a little bit. And I'm at least looking into it. Like, I just feel like every year I'm growing, and we should want that. We should incentivize that. And right now, with some portion of the left, we're doing the opposite.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the one thing that that I'd add to that is I think that it's probably hardest but most useful to try to get into that habit, as best we can, right? Of just like approaching some of this stuff with skepticism, thinking, okay, you heard something horrible about somebody, okay, maybe, right? But I'm not going to like jump on it and, cancel my support for somebody's campaign or whatever instantly because of it. I'm going to think about if there's like an innocent thing that might be put in a bad light here. And it's hardest to do that when you maybe like dislike somebody, which you might for all kinds of reasons, right? That in the decades, right, since he's politically evolved, since he wrote those blogs, right, Cenk has done commentary on tons of things that I'm sure tons of people have all sorts of reasons to disagree with, right? That like, and oftentimes, people form, these parasocial relationships with media figures that can lead to like, to like really feeling connected to them. That can also lead to like, just like deciding that like somebody who has enough takes that you dislike, like is just a terrible person. But if you can generally get in the habit of not like being quite such an easy mark for this stuff, even for the people that you don't necessarily like, then we're all going to be much better off. And to maybe circle back and close on this thing, about like the Morsi thing, the Alex Morse thing, right?
Mhm.
Or even like I remember several months ago when things were looking much more politically optimistic, when Joe Rogan said he was going to vote for Bernie Sanders, and people did, what they do and come up with like a gag reel of all the worst things that Rogan has ever said, and said, how dare you, accept the support from this terrible person. And in both cases, right, both that and the Morsi one were cases where people who were centrists, who had a political reason to want to do this, right, were very consciously stirring the pot to try to use this, against the left. And so then it's easy to kind of say, oh, okay, so therefore this one isn't really on us, right? This is on these like external bad actors who have a bad agenda. But then my question is, okay, but in both cases, why did so many people who really are on the left go along with it, right? And
Mhm.
I think that that's the way that maybe the same culture of sort of personalized moralistic nonsense that leads to people um, hearing Adolf Reed say that we should focus on poverty rather than racial disparities in poverty, even while being real about the racial history that led to those disparities. And here, oh, so what you're saying is that racism doesn't matter, or that leads to people being quite such easy marks for the Alex Morse thing, right? That like this stuff is not just like a bad way to relate to people, a bad way to go through life, although it's certainly all that, right? But it's also
Mhm.
something that really leaves us open to, makes us very weak and very, very attackable in ways that I think a version of the left that got over some of this stuff really wouldn't be.
Yeah, I think we also need to understand what a threat the left is to moneyed interests. And I mean, I just think that there needs to be a fundamental understanding that when you threaten the wealth and power of people who have enjoyed that wealth and power for so long, they will do anything and everything to destroy you, to divide you. And the fact that we are falling for their, disgusting, cynical strategies makes me very sad. It's sad to see it over and over and over again. And, I'm sure people are going to see this and cancel me, and okay, that's fine. But then what do you accomplish? Like, what is the end goal? And it might trigger something in your brain, the same way real activism and real organizing does. But in reality, you've accomplished nothing. And what we've seen year after year after year on every single issue, but since, civil unrest and race is really front and center right now, on race in particular, have we seen improvements on how Black people are treated in this country, or an improvement in their living conditions? Of course not. When it comes to actually changing and fundamentally restructuring the system that actually would lead to significant benefits, not just in their lives, but in everyone's lives, we're getting all this like superficial stuff that gives you like the cute aesthetics of change. And I'm sick of that. I'm really sick of that. I'm tired of them basically telling me like, oh no, we decided to pardon one person from prison and we publicized the hell out of it, and thus we've done criminal justice reform. No,
Right.
that's I'm
We've
sick of
still
that
got the
stuff.
highest incarceration rate in the world, but like we let out this person. We we still have this incredibly militarized style of policing, but don't worry, right? Any athletic event, even a hockey game, will have Black Lives Matter, logos on it. It's basically a situation where not only is there an attempt to kind of placate discontent with real problems, with really empty symbolism, but all too often we're falling for it, right? That like
Mm-hmm.
people really who identify with movements to change these things are really focused on those symbolic victories, right? We can't get like we're not going to actually change the underlying proportionate like distribution of wealth and power that disproportionately hurts Black people. but we can get, this street sign changed. We can get this company to make some PR gesture of putting up, Black Lives Matter at their events. We can get this company to fire somebody, who said something stupid on Twitter, and all of that really leaves them off the hook, because if all we're essentially demanding from people who have power is that they make the occasional gesture in the direction of caring about this stuff, then really their only question is going to be, okay, but like, you're not coming for any of the money, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's not about, shop signs and public statements. And look, I'm not minimizing the importance of renaming military bases that honor Confederate soldiers, right? But what my point is,
we shouldn't
is
have military bases named after Confederate soldiers, but it's also a little disturbing that was packaged together with giving even more money to the military, and it was still treated as some sort of progressive victory.
But think about that for a second, because it was so symbolic of how everything is going down right now in the United States, right? And it was all like summarized in one tweet. I think I retweeted it. It was something along the lines of military bases will be renamed, and Congress has approved increased military budget. But I mean, think about how, while we might rename bases, we're bombing and murdering Black and brown civilians throughout the world right now. Like, that is what we do. We murder people. Okay.
Yeah. You imagine like somebody in Yemen, like huddling like in a basement because there's bombing going on, maybe by the Saudis, but with American planes refueled at American bases, like reassuring their family members that don't worry, right? Like these bases where they're refueling don't have those terrible offensive names anymore.
Look at what we just did in Bolivia. I mean, we orchestrated a coup in Bolivia, and that has led to utter devastation for the Native community there. It's just indigenous community. I'm sorry about that, but for the indigenous community there. And was there any actual, example of like a democratic process following the ouster of, their leader? No, Evo Morales is gone, but now you have this right-wing government that's been incredibly brutal to, the indigenous community.
And keeps on announcing that they can't have elections because of coronavirus.
I mean, it's just, we need to take a step back and stop focusing on demanding like this facade. Like we're asking for it, we need to change the actual system, and we need to like restructure all of it. Otherwise, we're just playing the same game that honestly leads to more suffering, more pain, more poverty, more disenfranchisement, more division among races, more division within like the same political party or within the same movement. I mean, we're so fragmented, so divided, because the ruling class, the elite class, know how to play us, and we fall for it all the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anna. Really appreciate the conversation. Hope you come back soon.
Of course, I loved it. Thank you, and congratulations on your show. I absolutely love it.
All right. Thank you so much.